This is a podcast about pursuing what you're passionate about, and there is no one more passionate than the man I have here, Rudy Rochman. So, Rudy, thanks so much for being here today, and it's great to finally meet you in person.
Of course, my pleasure.
So it's a bit serendipitous that you were here. You're literally leaving tomorrow, so I'm really glad we were able to fit this in. And as you saw, one of the most recent episodes I did took a surprising turn, and we spoke about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. And after releasing this episode, I had several people messaging me, asking me questions and asking me to interview you. So I want to first start by understanding who you are as a person, and then we can, of course, dig into some more controversial topics, I guess, as one might say. But first and foremost, who is Rudy Rochman, and why is everyone asking me to interview you?
Well, first of all, I think it's amazing that you create a platform to bring diverse opinions, but that when there are some maybe negative opinions, that you are looking for the other side to make clear to your audience of what positions you stand for, and also the larger truth that exists that sometimes isn't conveyed when you just have one person speaking. My story actually begins in many different places. I usually start by talking about my story from going with my grandparents, because all of my grandparents were born in different countries. On my mom's side of the family, they were born in Morocco and Algeria, and in 1948 there was a massacre of the Jewish community living in Oujda, which is in Morocco but on the border of Morocco and Algeria. And from there, a lot of the community left as refugees and migrated to France. So my grandparents were included in that and left to France because of the persecution that they had faced in Morocco. On my dad's side of the family, my grandparents were born in Poland and Belgium. And as we know, many Jews in our grandparents' generation were killed due to the Shoah, due to the Holocaust. My grandparents survived. My grandfather hid in attics to survive. He actually went to France with his family and hid in attics. And my grandmother, her family went from Austria to Belgium, and they put her in a nunnery to survive, into a nun system where she would be pretending to be a Christian child in order for people to not go after her and to kill her because she was Jewish. Eventually, she also finds her way to France, and all of my grandparents become refugees going to France, both of my parents being born there, and then me being born there. And the reason I layer that in is because I realized from a young age that even though I was born in France, it's not really where I'm from. And even if I trace back to where my grandparents had come from, in those lands that we were living in, we were not treated as Polish, as being from Belgium, as being Moroccan, as being Algerian. We were Jews that were displaced from another place and that had been temporarily displaced in this location and that were always rejected for being something that was other. So that's kind of like playing in my psyche growing up of understanding, okay, I was born here, but I'm not really from here. At the age of 3, my family decides to move to Israel. Then age of 5, they moved to Miami, where you're now living. And in Miami, you would know that most people here are not American. You're Argentinian, Venezuelan, Colombian, Haitian, Jamaican, Cuban, Dominican, everything else but American for the most part. And so growing up in that kind of society, I had to identify as being from a place. Right? Everyone's from somewhere here, so I have to be from somewhere. And since my parents had thick French accents, and I spoke French, and I had been born there, even though I left at 3, I was labeled the French kid. And so I went on this journey of being like, okay, here I'm considered French, but when I go to France to visit my cousins, I'm the American cousin. On one side of the family, I'm Ashkenazi. The other side of the family, I'm Sephardi, even though my dad jokes that he converted to Sephardi when he married my mom, so I was raised fully Sephardi. But in the Jewish tradition, you take on what your father is usually. So going to Jewish day school, they would put me into a box of being Ashkenazi, although I was never raised with anything Ashkenazi in terms of my culture. And so I'm constantly having this struggle of identity that apparently who I am and where I come from depends on who's asking me the question or where the question is being asked. And that is, I think, the fundamental question that is sparking inside of me at a young age that wants me to find the answers of who am I really. And there's an experience that I go through when I was 7 years old, where I went to London with my mom and my younger brother. We got onto the red tour bus that does the tour of London, and my mom was wearing a shirt that was visibly in Hebrew, and the bus driver sees that we're Jewish and looks at my mom and tells her, you have to get off the bus as Jews. And my mom refuses, and he gets up and he throws my mom off the bus. And at that moment, everything became clear for me. It made me realize it doesn't matter where I was born, grew up, lived in, traveled to, reside in, what passport I have, where my grandparents were born, what I believe in or don't believe in, if I believe in God, if I don't believe in God. What mattered is that I'm a Jew. And that moment gave me the answer. This is who I am. This is where I'm from. Because although all my grandparents were born in different countries, I was born, raised in different places. I have different pieces of paper that we call passports that say different countries. None of these actually fundamentally define who I am. Who I am as a Jew, which is much more than just a belief system. It is an ancient civilization, a family, a people, a nation, and that's who I am. And the second thing that this moment did for me at a young age is it made me realize the next time I would deal with any form of hatred or bigotry or rejection against my collective, against my family, I'd have to be prepared, because I was not prepared in that moment. And that's prepared physically, emotionally, psychologically, intellectually, verbally, and even ideologically, understanding why do these people come to these crazy conclusions to hate my people, and how can I combat that and change the world that I live in.
That's a really hard thing to go through as a 7-year-old, seeing your mother being like pushed off of a bus just because she's Jewish. And what's interesting about being Jewish, right, is like you're not always wearing the symbols of being a Jew. Like I live in New York City and I'm now in Miami, but nowadays, unfortunately, like I don't want to wear my Jewish star or my Magen David or my Hebrew necklace outside on the streets of New York. Like it is scary right now. Like I walk outside and I see people actively hating our people. So that makes me feel scared to be proud of who I am. And I want to definitely understand like what makes you be so proud, since you are such a vocal person. And I think that's admirable, because right now it's really hard to be a proud Jew. And it's something I strive to be every single day, but I wasn't always this way. We'll get into that a little bit later on. But so after this experience, you ended up going into the army at 17 years old?
Yeah, so let's say at that moment, I'm living in Miami. Grew up most of my early childhood life in the US, between Miami, Palo Alto, different places. We moved around constantly. And 17 years old, I graduated from high school. And for me, it was very clear that Israel is my home. So why would every Israeli have to serve in the army and me be any different?
So you were living in Miami?
Yeah, I was living in Miami.
Oh,
I came to Israel at 17 as a lone soldier, which I technically volunteered, although in my heart, it was a service that I needed to do. And I came and I joined the paratroopers, which I still serve in the reservists till this day. Did my service from 2011 to 2013, and then from there I came to the US to do university, fought on college campuses, went to Columbia University specifically because it was listed as the #1 most anti-Semitic university, and the activism has just evolved from there. But I do want to touch on something that you just brought up about the fear of wearing your Magen David in public. I think it's very relevant even to myself, because whenever I'd go back to France to visit my cousins and my grandparents, they would always tell me, tuck in your Magen David, which I've never tucked in my entire life. And so I could understand rationally that from one perspective, yeah, maybe if I tuck in my Magen David, I would minimize the potential risk of an attack, because then I can go, unrecognized as a Jew. No one would know that I'm a Jew. So people that would want to attack me wouldn't be able to, or wouldn't even think of it, because I'm hiding my identity. However, when you're doing that as a Jew, you're intentionally putting out there to the universe that I'm okay with the status quo, that we should be hunted. And I'm going to accept that. Rather than doing something to change it, I'm going to literally accept it and to invest in that reality for it to continue. So I actually think it's the opposite. I think it's dangerous when we remove our Magen David, because although it might minimize the potential risk of an individual, it for sure guaranteed maximizes the risks for the entire collective, that we know exactly how it goes. Now, if you look at throughout Jewish history, every single time the Jewish people are united, empowered, fulfilling their purpose, fearless, proud of who they are, loving one another, miracles happen. Thousands of years of history, the same formula. The opposite happens when we're divided, when we hate one another, when we start to assimilate, when we accept idolatry, when we're afraid of who we are. Those are the worst chapters of Jewish history in the moment that anti-Semitism rises. So it's almost as if there's an algorithm in the universe that we're experiencing. And the algorithm is, it's like, although the world is scary and a lot of people hate the Jews, the more you hide away from who you are, the less people respect you and the more people hate you. And the more that you're proud of who you are and you stand up for what it is, the more people actually respect you and stand up for who you are.
No, I can agree with you, obviously, to an extent. But as someone who is still, I'm very vocal about who I am as a person. Sure. I wasn't always like this. When I grew up, I remember in the second grade, I know the boy's name in my head. The second grader told me, "Oh, Kayla, you have a big nose because you're Jewish." I learned what the K word was as an 18-year-old because my ex-boyfriend's ex-girlfriend used that term to me, right? My whole life, we've all experienced anti-Semitism, whether people want to believe that or not. So it was never that I was not proud to be Jewish, but it was something I always kept internal to me. I grew up in a very non-Jewish neighborhood. I was always the only Jew on my basketball team. I went to college. I was the only Jew in my sorority and things like that. Like I was never around a community. And it might be shocking for some of my friends or listeners to hear, because in the last year I've been totally outspoken about Israel and about being a proud Jew, because I'm done. Like I'm not going to stand for this anymore. But with that being said, I'm still afraid to wear my jewelry, my Judaica, and I don't know if that's something that like comes with more time, right, and being more comfortable. Like this has been something that's been like a newer revelation for me as someone that's been more outspoken within the last year since October 7th, right? But I don't feel like I have what I need to be equipped to fight someone on the street. Like I've done Krav Maga, once or twice, right? But I don't have the tools maybe physically and maybe even, just the knowledge. And that's what I want to learn from you today. Like, what are some tips for like Jewish people listening to be able to like enable us to actually have real conversations and be able to understand like what we can say to people when they stop us on the street and say some horrible remark to us?
Right. So there's two things that's interesting. Number one is that from your story, October 7th and the rise of anti-Semitism made you tap into who you are, made you own who you are. And same thing for me. That experience when I was 7 years old with anti-Semitism made me realize who I am and made me own it. So it's interesting how anti-Semitism kind of sparks our passion for being who we are and for staying true to who we are. So it's almost as if it's like we're on the path, we get off the path, we start to assimilate, forget, try to blend in. Anti-Semitism wakes us up and we go right back on the path. So anti-Semitism is almost like a plan B when we start to go off of where we're supposed to be. And it's like the universe's way to correct us back to the path. And the second thing that you say is like, I truly believe this sentence, that the only thing Jews should fear is what happens when Jews begin to fear. And being afraid of wearing your Magen David, in my opinion, is what creates the negativity that will come your way and the anti-Semitism will come. And when you own who you are, it's like, again, I use this term algorithm because I've been through so many different experiences dealing with anti-Semites from the far right to the far left and every single kind that you could imagine, in front of 300 people chanting for the death of me specifically, in prison in Nigeria for trying to help the Jews there, in Gaza in war, in Lebanon in war. And I've seen it every single time when I'm in front of an anti-Semite. When you show zero fear, full emunah in Hashem, full emunah in who you are, it's like a cheat code that just deactivates them. They have no idea how to respond to that.
So you just said a term. Can you explain that term you just said for those listening?
Hashem. So Hashem is the name. There's 72 names of God according to the Jewish culture. And Hashem literally means the name, and it's the word that we use to describe God, because we don't view God as one individual. We viewed God as oneness, as the infinite divine of time, space, of everything combined. This oneness is Hashem, and the Jewish people have a fundamental belief and connection to this oneness, as many other indigenous cultures throughout the world do. And so for me, I think that when you fully believe in Hashem and in who you are as a Jew and aren't afraid to show it, there is a response within the physical experience of reality that we go through that is always one that you will be protected. And the inverse happens when you reject that.
So I want to take a step back and understand your college experience, because you served in the Army, the Israeli Defense Forces, and then you decided, I'm going to go to Columbia. Was your intention to go to Columbia? I mean, of course, you said it's, it is a top school in the country. It's also one of the most anti-Semitic universities in the country. But was your intention to go there to pursue activism further, or were you studying something else in pursuit of a traditional 9-to-5 career path?
So keep in mind, I finished the Army in 2013. And I would say that most of the Jewish community, even in America, was not aware that anti-Semitism was growing, especially at that time. And so I start university actually at UCLA. My family had moved to Los Angeles while I was in the Army. I decided to start school simultaneously at UCLA and Santa Monica College to do 2 years worth of school within 1 year. I went to 2 different schools at the same time. And my goal was, my grade is already a few years ahead. I had gone to do the Army. I want to catch back up to them. And so I started there. And when I got to UCLA, I realized that there were groups on campuses that were using the suffering of every single minority that they can attach themselves to the Black cause, to the Native American cause, to the gay cause, to the Hispanic cause, to literally every single cause, and convincing them that their source of suffering was either the same thing Israel was doing to the Palestinians, or that Israel was even responsible for their own suffering. So they would go to the Black Student Union and say, oh, you suffer from police brutality and racism? Well, Israel's doing the same thing to the Palestinians. Or they'd go even further and say, well, actually, Israel trains the police in America to do bad things to black people. Like, what? How'd you get to such a sentence? And then you look into it, and it's because they sourced that there was one time a Krav Maga instructor, which you've taken Krav Maga, Israeli self-defense. It's actually to remove yourself from situations, not to actually fight, to get yourself to be protected and to remove yourself from any fights to protect your life. And there was a person who was Israeli, who was 40 years old, who 20 years before had done the army, but is now completely a civilian and teaches people how to defend themselves. He came one time and gave one class to one precinct in New York City. And because the police are connected to racism, are connected to bad cops and police brutality, and this guy happens to be Israeli, who had done the army 20 years before, was connected to the IDF, we're just gonna connect police brutality and racism to the IDF. As if like racism only started in 1948 in America when Israel was created, right? So it's even a ridiculous thing to say, but these are the things that they source, and their real intention here is to manipulate the suffering of what people identify in society. People see that there is police brutality, people see that there is racism, people see that there's homophobia, people see that there's sexism, and so these emotions that the youth have of wanting to fix those problems, they recognize that, and they ride on that, and ride on their real emotions and intentions, but link that to the Jewish people in Israel, which is historically how anti-Semitism has been spread. You find the source of suffering and you blame it on the Jewish people. Death of Jesus, blame it on the Jews. Economic situation after World War I, leading to the Holocaust, blame it on the Jews. Economic situation in Spain after the failure of the colonization of Spain, leading to the Inquisition, blame it on the Jews. Black Plague, blaming it on the Jews. COVID, blame it on the Jews. Literally anything that happens bad in society, give it a day or two, there will be an article finding a way to attach that to the Jewish people. We are always seen as the source of our problems. And the way that it's being represented on college campuses, and also the reason why it's so important, is because they represent the future political and intellectual class of the next generation. People coming from universities, although the majority of society is not going to university, the majority of people who change the culture of society are going to university. So the next businessmen, lawyers, doctors, politicians, people in media are coming from these spaces and are being indoctrinated with all these different kind of ideas as they go through this manufacturing plant, and they're being taught that if you truly want to fight for justice and make the world a better place, you must be against Israel and the Jewish people. And that's how they're convincing the entire younger generation. So I get there, right, and I'm realizing that this is taking place. And I'm like, what do you mean you hear about the story of Israel from people who are anti-Israel? You don't hear about black rights from KKK members. You don't hear about women's rights from misogynists. So why are the only people talking about Israel and the Jewish people those that are anti-Israel and anti the Jewish people? How does that make sense? And I was raised with the majority of the family on my father's side having been exterminated in the Shoah, exterminated in the Holocaust. And for me, whenever I heard the sentence, never again, which is something we repeat at least once, if not twice a year, it didn't mean, oh, I'm just going to say this ceremonial yearly phrase and feel better about myself. For me, it meant this commitment to make sure that this generation will make sure it doesn't happen again. And so I'm realizing, wait a minute, we're doing nothing about this. And so I started looking within to the Jewish community. And I realized we would do an event once in a blue moon in the Hillel, in the Chabad, in the API house, in the Jewish organizations, the Jewish safe spaces on campuses. And we would do very shallow events that made Jews feel proud, like Israel created the cherry tomatoes and Waze and drip irrigation and the USB, and there's a pill that you swallow that's a camera that can track the different medical problems you have in your stomach, and Israel created all those nice things in the Jewish safe space to the already pro-Israel Jews for us to feel good about ourselves. We have a little hummus and some Israel flags and some Omer Adam music, and we'd feel good that wow, we created our safe space and Israel's so amazing, rather than realizing that our responsibility here is to narrate the story of our people to this audience. And we were refusing to do that. In fact, the very events of all these shallow, watered down, cherry tomatoes, Waze, drip irrigation, Israeli technology events were only to numb ourselves from the responsibility, to make ourselves feel good when our soul knew that we had the responsibility to do something there. And so that's when I was like, okay, I have to go to the...
Yeah, so sorry to interrupt you, but you do say something, first and foremost, I want to go back to is anti-Israel and anti-Jewish.
Sure.
And I think that's a big debate nowadays. I have a lot of non-Jewish friends that say, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Israel. Mm-hmm. What would you say to those people?
That's like saying, I'm not anti-black people, but I'm anti-black people having equal rights. I'm not anti the Jewish people, but I'm anti the Jewish people's rights to live in their land and to self-determine. Like someone, imagine saying, oh, I like the Native Americans, but the Native Americans should have no access to the reservation. I like the Aboriginal in Australia, but they should be kicked out from their land. Or the Maoris in New Zealand, they have no right to live in their land. Or the Polynesians in Hawaii, or the Native Canadians in Canada, or the Tibetans in Tibet. When you look in society, those that are making that argument are more so coming on the left, and those on the left value all these communities and the rights. But when it comes to the Jews, they don't value ours. So to be critical of Israel is different than being anti-Israel. I don't know one Israeli who isn't critical of Israel. Find me one Israeli that isn't criticizing the Israeli government, Bibi Netanyahu, different policies, there's not one Israeli. You won't find them. In fact,
you should in every government.
Absolutely.
Are we always happy to be American and praise all of our leaders? Absolutely not. We would be crazy to think that, but you can still be proud of where you come from without agreeing with everything your government's doing.
The criticism is not anti-Semitism, is that your anti-Semitism is not criticism. Right? And that's the difference, that what they're going against is the very right for us to exist. They're demonizing us, trying to make us seem as the source of all evil and the worst people in the world, which is one of the 3Ds of anti-Semitism. They're delegitimizing us, trying to disconnect us from our history, from our identity, from our connection to this land, from the archaeology that exists, from the anthropology that shows who we truly are. And they're dehumanizing us, trying to make us as others, and holding clearly a double standard. You care about all indigenous peoples. You want indigenous peoples to have access to their lands in their own ways. But when the Jewish people create the most successful indigenous liberation movement that ever existed, where the first time in history native people came home, decolonized their land from the colonial force being the British, decolonized their tongue, bringing back a dead native language called Hebrew, and created a model of light and success to all minorities and indigenous peoples around the world. Now you have a problem? And you claim to be pro-Palestinian also? Well, how about when Palestinians are dying by the thousands in the Syrian civil war, or by the hundreds of thousands of refugee camps in Lebanon and in Jordan till this day, or suffering under the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, where there is no freedom of speech, where if you disagree with anything and say something, you disappear. You don't criticize or talk about Palestinians in those contexts of suffering. If you truly cared about Palestinian suffering, you'd care across the board, including when Israel is a part of it. A lot of people think that to be pro-Israel, you have to be anti-Palestinian, or to be pro-Palestinian, you have to be anti-Israel. Actually, if you're anti-either, you're anti-both. Because there's no reality where either will disappear. Palestinians exist here. They're actually our cousins, not just from them being Arabs and us being descendant from Abraham and Ishmael being the father of the Arabs and Isaac, his brother, being the father of the Jews. But also 60% of Palestinian DNA is Jewish DNA. A big percentage of Palestinians actually are Jews that were converted to Islam and Christianity over time. So we're even closer cousins to them than the rest of the Arab world, which we're also cousins to. They are a part of this land and they're not going anywhere. So I'm actually, as an Israeli, as someone who comes from this land, who fights for this land and fights to continue the future of the Jewish people, not only are Palestinians my family, I identify as being very pro-Palestinian. I'm pro that their future exists in a way that works for them, but also works for me. And to continue using this zero-sum game mentality of it's going to be either one over the other is the very fuel that allows our conflict to continue. Which, by the way, neither the Israelis or Palestinians are profiting from. We're both suffering. There are actually corporations and countries that are profiting from our war to continue and want us to be fighting. And all these other, let's say, white students on college campuses and all these Western countries that are coming with these big opinions, if they truly cared to do something to help us, they would try to bring us together and to specify the problems so that we can fix them, not generalize terms to demonize each other. And it's interesting, all these words that are being used like apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing, colonization, settlements, all these trigger words that are constantly being recycled. One year it's this word, the next year it's this word, then it's going back to this word, then it's going back to that word. What was always interesting to me is, you look at these words being used in white societies in Europe and in America and in Canada and all these college campuses where you have these students who come and stand up against those things. But who is actually guilty of that in history? Of apartheid, of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, of colonization, of settlements. Those very white societies. Those are the societies that did that. And the far left of those societies feel so guilty for the crimes of their ancestors that rather than looking in the mirror and realizing, wow, we really messed up this world, let's go and fix it, they have to project their white guilt onto the Jewish people and blame us for what they're actually guilty of. That's what's going on here. Now, it doesn't mean that Palestinians are experiencing freedom and justice. Actually, no one in this land is experiencing justice. There's complete injustice in this land. But why don't we specify the problems that Palestinians go through? how there's limited access of resources or access to movement, or how do we create a reality that we fulfill the aspirations where both peoples want to live from the river to the sea? How do we create that reality while also still retaining the needs of both populations? One side wants right of return for the Palestinians, and one side, the Jewish people, wants to make sure that it's a Jewish country and that the leadership and government is going to be Jewish. How do you create a reality that works for both? Well, let's actually discuss what are the non-negotiables of both sides and find a way to build there. It's not going to be a document that we sign and the next day we're all living fine. It's a journey, it's a process, but we're not starting that process. All we're doing is blaming each other for being the source of our problem while other countries get rich off selling weapons to both sides and making sure that we stay in conflict while we're actually still dying and inheriting a conflict that we didn't start and passing it down to the next generations.
Yeah. So Rudy, you said a lot there. I think what I want to unpack a little bit more is your time serving on reserve duty since you went back recently. And can you actually describe like what is reserve duty for those of the listeners that may not know?
Sure. So I finished the Army in 2013, but when you're a combat soldier in Israel, you're still on reserves till at least age 40, 42. Some people go even longer. And that's because Israel is such a small country. You can imagine small country, small population, many bigger countries surrounding us, much bigger populations, much bigger armies, who in the past we've had many wars with. We're no longer at war with Egypt, but we used to be. We're no longer at war with Jordan, but we used to be. Syria, Lebanon, still a problem. Gaza, West Bank, still issues going on there with the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Yemen now is becoming a problem. There's a lot of surrounding in our region countries, even Iran, who have huge populations, huge militaries, huge air forces, huge navies that could destroy us easily in terms of numbers. So that's why you can't just serve from 18 to 21. You have to stay as a soldier in order for your army to be slightly bigger than just the 18 to 31.
And how old are you?
I'm 31 now.
31.
And so I've been doing reserves since 2013. It usually consists of, a few trainings a year and a service every few years for a month in a different place. Or when there's a war, you get the call and you get brought back. So that's what happened to me on October 7th. I got a call and already at 4 p.m. I was fighting Hamas in Kfar Aza on the border of Israel.
So can you share a little bit more about your experience, not only serving as a 17-year-old, but now serving during this war? And given, oftentimes we see like the media is so biased, right, against Israel and especially against the IDF. And I've had, we've all had personal relationships, whether that's fights with family members or best friends. Like I personally have best friends who are Lebanese Muslim, and they do not see this conflict through the same lens whatsoever. And their family has been directly impacted by war with Israel, So I don't blame them for having a different perspective. Like, of course, if you've been through something personally, like we all have our own biases, right? But number one, what would you do in this situation where, maybe you don't see this conflict through the same lens as someone else? Like, how do you handle relationships moving forward?
Sure. So first of all, there's like two fights that I'm in. There's the ideological combat on college campuses in debating people that are anti-Israel in society, and then there's the physical combat. Now, just to wrap up the story, when I was a student at UCLA, I realized that there was a much bigger issue than just at UCLA, and I went on Google, typed in #1 most anti-Semitic university in North America, and there was a top 10 list that year. And #1 on that list was Columbia. So I chose to transfer to Columbia and became an activist there. And I decided if I can change it at the most radicalized place, there should be no more excuses given by other Jews who are like, oh, well, it's too hard, I can't do it. On the other hand, there's also the physical combat, which is not what I would like to do. I'm not someone who wants to be at war. But if my family is being killed, I'm going to stand up and doing something about it. I'm also not a pacifist, whereas if my family's in danger, I'm not going to just look at the situation and do nothing of it. So that's what happened on October 7th. I was waking up with my family. My cousin was supposed to get married that week. So all family from France and the US had come to celebrate the wedding. It was Sukkot, which is a Jewish holiday. It was Shabbat, and it was also Simchat Torah, like 3 Jewish holidays at once. I remember we did the Shabbat dinner under the sukkah, and the next morning we were supposed to honor my grandfather with a big kiddush, with a big meal planned at the synagogue after doing the services. And I wake up at around 7:30, 8 in the morning, not to getting ready to go to shul, but my mom in tears, in coming with her phone and showing me images of Jews being massacred as we speak. That morning, the moments that she was showing me those images in the southern region of Israel. And immediately when I saw those images, I recognized this was a little bit different than normal terrorism that we usually go through in Israel, which is an attack here, an attack there. This was a massacre of as many people as they can, coming on in full armies, and I knew this would be different. And so I started packing my stuff. My mom asked me, like, what are you doing? And I told her, this is not a normal attack. This is going to mean war, and I'm a part of a unit that if there's a war, I get called back immediately. And so I started packing my stuff, and it didn't take 30 minutes before I got that call saying ukpatsta, which in Hebrew means you're getting jumped, called back into war. Drove as fast as I could to my apartment in Jerusalem, dropped off all of my civilian clothes, my suits, all the things I had packed for the wedding, my toiletries, my spare clothes, picked up my gear, my uniform that I had packed already for a day like this, knowing that any day like this can happen. Drove as fast as I could to the base. They gave us a gun. They loaded us in these Hummers. They drove us south. We had no idea where we're going. We drive. All of a sudden we pass this like checkpoint of police officers, and they open the barricades and we just go through. And that's the moment we realized we're being sent right now to fight Hamas. And we're fighting Hamas in Kfar Aza, which was one of the hardest hit Jewish communities of civilians massacred by Hamas terrorists, like the most gruesome of things you can imagine, not just killing them, torturing them, burning them, cutting fingers off, doing like the most gruesome things that I'm not going to get into detail with, that you arrive there and you see the aftermath of what happened. You see people like blown into pieces intentionally, from like how they were treating them, and it's still ongoing. And so for 3 days we fought Hamas in Kfar Aza. Then our unit was sent up to the north expecting that we would go into Lebanon. Then they realized Lebanon would happen later. They brought us back down south, and then our unit went into Khan Yunis, which was one of the strongest outposts of Hamas, where we fought for 2 months in Gaza. Then we got out of war in February, was able to go back to the ideological combat, and then in the summer I got called back to serve on the border with Lebanon, and then was sent into Lebanon to fight against Hezbollah. So it's been a crazy year for me, but I recognize that both of them are wars. One's an ideological war, where people are trying to do everything that they can to make my people look as the worst thing in the world and to gather the nations of the world to turn against my people. And one's a physical war, actually having to physically fight to defend. But they're both spiritual wars. They're both a consequence of something. And I think that the most interesting thing to talk about, especially for our generation, is why. Why is there this obsession with the Jewish people? I mean, it doesn't mean that there isn't other forms of xenophobia. Like there is also racism, there's also sexism. Other people experience xenophobia. But usually those who are racist are extremist white people. Usually those who are against women are extremist men. It's usually one opposite group. When it comes to the Jews, all of them are against us. The far right thinks the Jews are the left. The far left thinks the Jews are the right. The capitalist blames us for communism. The communist blames us for capitalism. The neo-Nazis, if you think of the white supremacist, most neo-Nazi person, KKK member you can think of, ask them who enemy number one is, and they'll tell you the Jew before a black person, before Native Americans, before Hispanic for the most part. And you go to the extremist black supremacist, the Farrakhan's, right? The people who are like, oh, only black people, the white people are devils, and just hate the complete other side of the energy. And usually it's as a response psychologically to the trauma that they experienced to racism. But ask the Farrakhan's who enemy number one is, and they'll tell you the Jew. What's crazy is that all extremes agree on only one thing in the world. And the one thing that they agree on is that the Jews are the source of the problem. Even how they're the source of the problem, they'll disagree on, but that we are the problem, they'll all agree on. And I think there's a reason why we're experienced that way. It's not because of something that we did, because we know we didn't create these world problems. I think it's because of something that we didn't do. And the mission collectively of the Jewish people is to do tikkun olam and ol hagoim, to heal the world, whether there's hatred, jealousy, materialism, idolatry, famine, economic problems, environmental problems. We took on the responsibility, which is not proprietary. Other nations can choose to do it too. But in the meantime, we chose to do this and to be ol hagoim, light to the nations, to empower other nations to fulfill their potential. And when we don't do that job, because that's basically what in the human body is the immune system. In the body, the only thing in the body that heals the body of all diseases and empowers the rest of the body to fulfill its purpose is the immune system. When the immune system in the body doesn't do its job, the body becomes sick. It's not the immune system that created the diseases, but it was the immune system's lack of fulfilling its role that allowed those diseases to happen. So it's not us that created the world's problems, but because we're not doing our job, there are problems being created, and all the rest of the nations are blaming us for being the source of it. Even though we're not the source of the problems, we're supposed to be the source of their solution. And so in my opinion, anti-Semitism is a rejection of the Jewish people failing our purpose. And that's why there's this obsession with us. Wherever you go, throughout time, throughout borders, it is because we are not tapping into who we need to be. And we see that throughout history. The formula, whenever the Jews are themselves, are united, are empowered, miracles. Whenever we're divided, hating, assimilating, idolatry, forgetting who we are, afraid of who we are, horrible disasters.
Yeah. No, you offer some really, really great insight. And I want to just go back to just like your time on reserve duty. Because I think, no army's perfect, right? There's never going to be an army, a government, nothing in the world is perfect. You can argue that on both sides, we've done some wrongdoings, right? But you've been in battle, you've been on the ground. So as a soldier, like, what would you say to the people that are so quick to blame the IDF for every single issue that has happened during this war?
So what I'm going to say doesn't mean there's no wrongdoings in the IDF. But those people who are quick to blame, they don't care about how things happen or why things happen. They just care about some of the what that happens. So if you care only about sometimes Palestinians dying in the conflict of a war, but you don't ask yourself, how did this happen? Why did this happen? What happened that led us to this situation? You don't actually care about solving it to prevent it from happening again. You just care to selectively choose which instance of Palestinian suffering you can use in order to manipulate and create political ammunition against Israel. Because like I said earlier, there are Palestinians suffering right now under Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, but there's never any mention of that. There's Palestinians that are in refugee camps since 1948 in different places in the Arab world. No one's talking about that. And why are you not talking about that? It's because they don't, most of them, don't actually care about Palestinians. And if they did, you wouldn't only, I'm not saying to talk less about Palestinian suffering with Israel. I'm saying to talk more about it. Specify what are the things that you're against. Don't just say, oh, well, a Palestinian was killed in an Israeli bomb. Well, what happened? Well, Hamas was there shooting rockets at Israeli civilians and then forced their civilians to be in those buildings, grabbing them and telling them, if you move from here, we will kill you, so might as well you stay here because you have more of a chance to live. And then Israel doesn't even know that there are civilians there for most of the time. It's shooting back at a place that's shooting at it. Well, before it even shot back, sent many warnings, sent leaflets written in Arabic saying, please stop, we're going to bomb this area, any civilian, please vacate the area. If the goal of Israel was to kill people, why would they send leaflets to warn the people to leave the very area that they're in? They're going to call the phones of all the people that have like technology to just press a button and there's a phone call that goes to all the cellular phones there, warning the civilians to leave because they want to limit the amount of civilian casualties.
Do you know of any other armies that do that?
No. And you know what? I don't need to be compared to any other armies because, if you're the only good person on the street, you don't need to see yourself as, oh, I'm hired. No, I'm normal. This is the norm. We should be doing everything we can to limit civilian casualties in all situations, and any civilian dying is horrible. But if you truly care about those civilians dying, then talk about how it happened, why it happened, in order for us to solve it, in order for us to stop it from happening. Right? If a person goes and pushes another person into the fire, the coroner's office might say the cause of death is a fire, but the murderer is the person who pushed them. So the cause of death might be like a battlefield between Israel and Hamas and an explosion that happened from Israel's side or Hamas side. But the cause of death is the person who created this reality intentionally for more Palestinians to die in order to use their body count of how many people were dying and to show that to the world and say, look how evil Israel is. So not only are they targeting Israeli civilians, which the world doesn't care about, you don't talk about when Israeli civilians die, that's a whole other issue, but now you don't even really care about Palestinians. And so many people are just being dragged into this because all they see is images of people dying, and they're like, that's horrible, which it is. But if you really care about those lives, not the lives that we've lost already, which is unfortunate, but the lives that we will lose, because this conflict will continue. Even if there's a resolution found in Gaza, give it a few years, it's going to erupt again, right? And my kids at some point, B'ezrat Hashem, when I will have kids soon, will have to join the army. I would like to pass down to my children a reality where a Palestinian child or an Israeli child feels safe in their homeland. And if we truly care about creating that reality, let's not just manipulate information to make the other side look bad. Let's actually get to the bottom of where this has come from. And there's absolutely no problem with criticizing Israel if you are specific about it. Say, I'm against this politician because this policy X, and in this military operation, they should have done this different. I understand why they had done that, but then if they would have done this, it might talk about the specifics of how you can change the situation in order to better the outcome, not just the unfortunate outcome without any context, to not even understand why we're in here, and to just be a parent that chooses to take a suffering of one to just inflict more suffering on both.
There's extremists on both sides, and I wish people could be more human to human and just have a conversation. And that's what I love about the work that you do, is that you're going to college campuses, you're challenging people in an extremely respectful way and just able to have a really open conversation, human to human. Like, let's talk about it. Like, there's pain on both sides, and it makes it really difficult to have conversations. But without having that open communication, where do we find middle ground? Where do we have a world where people can live side by side by our neighbors, by our people? Again, like, we're all one and the same, we're all from the same land. And it's been a really hard year for me personally, like having best friends who are Lebanese Muslim, who were my sisters, right? We're the same, we look the same. We might not be the same religion, but we are the same people. And it's like, how do you come around to be able to have these open conversations and really, not take such an extremist point of view, but be open with each other? And I think it's something we have to all get better at. And so I just praise you for the work that you're doing. And I think we talked about a lot of different buzzwords, and the one thing I do want to get onto the subject of, because this came up in the last interview I did, is this term Zionism, and how the last man I interviewed said that there are two clear definitions of Zionism. Do you believe that that is to be true? And if not, what is your definition of Zionism?
I mean, it's not my definition. There's one definition. It's an actual word. It's in the dictionary. It's in, there's historical records. It's a movement. But I think there's two interpretations of Zionism. So Zionism comes from the word Zion, which there's a lot of different cultures who use this word, especially in Rastafari culture and in Bob Marley's music. They talk a lot about Zion. And Zion is this idea of this homeland, but the capital of that homeland. For specifically the Jews, we use the term Zion to describe Jerusalem. This is the capital of our civilization, the heart of our land, and that's Zion to us. So the idea of Zionism, whenever you have an ism at the end of the word, feminism, Zionism, capitalism, communism, whatever ism that exists, it's a human-made social structure. And the social structure of Zionism was the idea that the Jewish people, living mostly in the diaspora, although there was always a presence of Jews in our homeland, that the Jews should have a right to return back to Zion. And there should be a movement that was created in order to get us back there. And that's the movement of Zionism. Now, with Zionism, there are people who are more right-wing, there are people who are more left-wing, there are people who are Jewish, there are people who are not Jewish, there are people who are bad people, and there are people who are good people. It's like saying someone who supports, chocolate ice cream, right? You can be a man and like chocolate, and you can be a woman and like chocolate. You could be a bad person like chocolate, be a good person. So you can't say, oh, this one person was bad and likes chocolate, so now all people who like chocolate are bad. So you can't give a very minority example of some bad Zionists that are out there and say, look at what they said, this now means that this defines Zionism. Because there's many different branches of Zionism. As a core idea, the right for the Jewish people to return back to their homeland, which has nothing to do with Palestinians and nothing to do with the conflict. Because you're a Zionist doesn't mean any opinion about Palestinians. Any opinion that you have, whether good or bad of Palestinians, is separate to the term Zionism. Now, unfortunately, the world for the past, let's say, 10, 15 years has been indoctrinated to associate Zionism to Palestinian suffering. Why? Because they want to delegitimize our right to do what Zionism means, which is to live there. So let's attach your right to live there to Palestinian suffering, and then people will be against it. So whenever I'm getting into a conversation with someone and they're like, are you a Zionist? Because already from the tone of that question, I already recognize that they don't even know what Zionism means. Rather than saying yes and getting into a fight, I'm like, well, what do you define as Zionism? And in hearing their definition, well, it's Palestinian suffering and the oppression and the this and all this. I was like, well, I'm against all that stuff and actually fight for that. I'm constantly bringing Israelis and Palestinians together, educating people, removing hate from our societies, doing the daily work to change that reality on the ground so that people understand to value the Palestinian narrative and their right to live in this land as well.
Yeah, if that were the definition of Zionism to me, I would be against it as well.
Right, but that's not the find me one Zionist that defines it that way. You won't find one, right? It's only anti-Zionists that define anti-Zionism as anti-Palestinian suffering when Zionism doesn't mean Palestinian suffering. So you actually are using a wrong definition, but you're using that wrong definition because you were intentionally implanted with that definition to get you to be against Zionism, which is our right to exist, which as long as the Palestinian movement represents itself as a threat and as an attack to the Jewish people living in this land, the Jewish people will constantly feel attacked, will have to defend themselves. They happen to be 100 times stronger. So when you attack someone who's 100 times stronger and kill their people, they're going to defend themselves 100 times away and create more problem and more death that happen. And we're in a loop. A loop. And at some point we need to be like, wait a minute. Is the point of all of our actions and our passion and our energy and the very purpose of why we exist in this generation at this time right now, is the purpose of why we're here to just participate in creating that loop, in creating that snowball to just get worse and worse? Or are we going to step out of it for a second and realize, wait a minute, we can actually do something to change this reality and to be a part of the generation that fixes that situation? I mean, look at the past. There once was a time where China and Japan hated each other. We're at wars. Where Germany and France, where Sweden and England, where countries were at complete odds with one another, hated one another, went to 100 years wars together. Today, it's not the same. Today, they're okay with one another because time can change. And if the Germans, who wanted to kill and successfully killed 6 million Jews, but wanted to kill all the Jewish people, that same civilization, 10 years later, was supporting the state of Israel. If that extreme change can happen within 10 years, definitely between cousins we can change things. But two things have to happen for both sides. The Israeli side has to recognize the Palestinian connection to this land, the Palestinian suffering that they go through, and the role that we have. Although we didn't create the problems, we have the power to correct them, and we're not fulfilling that role, and we're failing in that sense. And the Palestinians have to understand that this is the home of the Jewish people, just as it is your home. We come from this land, and we're not going anywhere. And any form of attack will only cause more attacks on both sides. So at some point, we need to recognize each other's space and to try to create a reality that fulfills the aspirations of both peoples, which are different and not mutually exclusive, and end the injustices that both experience, which are also different and are not in competition.
Well, thank you, Rudy, for sharing that. I do want to have you leave anyone listening with what makes you a proud Israeli and a proud Jew. And it's admirable, especially in today's day and age, to continue to be so outspoken. And I think a lot of people can shy away from their identity as a Jew and as maybe an Israeli or whatever that may be. So what makes you proud, and how can you spread that to others?
For sure. So I look at it as I'm a part of this nation, this family called the Nation of Israel. That nation has 12 tribes. I come from the tribe of Levi, which are the priest, spiritual leader tribes. But today, a synonym for being an Israelite is a Jew, just as once upon a time, a synonym was called the Hebrew. These are different names during different periods of time, but all referring to one big family, which I'm the living, breathing continuation of. And I represent a generation that finally was able to revive their ancient civilization that was destroyed by the Romans 2,000 years ago, to reunite our people from the four corners of the earth that were exiled, and to create a model of light and success to all minorities around the world. Now, if there are problems within Israel, instead of looking at it and pointing fingers and stepping away from it, point a finger and walk towards it. Be a part of those in Israel that change the problems that exist in Israel. Don't just point a finger and run away from who you are. Own who you are, understand who you are, and only when Jews respect themselves will other nations respect who we are.
Wow, that's great advice, Rudy. Thank you so much again for being here. Appreciate your time. I know you have a documentary coming out, potentially.
Yes.
When is it coming out, and can you share a little bit more?
So it's coming out in 2025, B'ezrat Hashem. If there's no other wars that I'm going to be pulled out and have to pause my passion. Our documentary series called We Were Never Lost. It's a documentary series that showcases the stories of the disconnected, quote-unquote, lost tribes of Jews. Today's Jewish population, the 15 million that we are, we're the descendants of 2.5 out of 12 tribes, which means there's 9.5 tribes that are still out there that have yet to return. And our series focuses on those stories. Season 1 is in Africa, 2 is in Asia, 3 is in South America. So right now we've been, for the past 3 years, going to Nigeria, Uganda, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Madagascar, Ethiopia, and Ivory Coast, finding descendants of Israelites who have thriving Jewish communities, but are also persecuted for being Jewish, have very similar experiences. It's almost like a mirror experience of what we're going through. And our goal is to revive those stories, bring them back to the consciousness of our time, and reunite our greater family to become who we're supposed to be by all the pieces being brought back. So hopefully in the next 6 to 8 months, it will be out and ready for people to see.
Wow, very exciting. I can't wait to watch. Well, thank you again, Rudy. Where can people find you?
On social media. You can go on Instagram, Rudy_Israel. Israel is my Hebrew name. On Facebook, Rudy Rochman. YouTube, TikTok, every single platform that exists. You can go out there, just type in my name and you'll be able to find it.
Okay. Thanks, Rudy.
Of course.